Hi, this is Richard and Craig with week 2 feedback video. And we'd just like to say hello to our over 6,000 learners from all around the globe. And just to thank you again for your excellent comments and conversations that are happening on the forum this week. It's a very important course, this one, and a very important week in the course because we go from perhaps focusing a little more on ourselves, which is where mindfulness often begins, to focusing on others and becoming aware of the way that we're relating to other people around us. And it's been a really fascinating week reading some of the comments in the forum.
Yeah, and I think those two things really go together, Richard. The learning mindfulness, some people think it's a kind of a self-obsessed thing. But when you actually look at all the default mental activity we have going on in our own heads, when we become more mindful, we stop with that all of that inner self-talk so much. And that really opens the gateway to engage our attention with others. And that really opens up the whole arena of learning more about relationships and communication. So it's kind of the basics of mindfulness really prepare the ground to make that change.
Definitely, it's so true. And I've heard an expression that I really like, that if you think you're enlightened, go hang out with your family for a week. And perhaps we could say, if you think you're enlightened, just go into lockdown for 3 months and you'll really start to see some of those entrenched patterns. But I really like that some of our learners pointed out that classic quote by Viktor Frankl, this idea that between the stimulus and the response is a little bit of space. And mindfulness, of course, grows that space so that we can start to notice the reactive patterns that we have, but also to start cultivating different ways of being with other people. And I've really loved the comments this week, Craig, about empathy and compassion. There's been so much great learning happening around that, hasn't there?
Yeah, and a number of learners really reflecting on the empathy, and we're using these two words which could be used with different meanings, but what we mean by it is that kind of empathy which a lot of learners described as being heavy. Aware of the burden of somebody else, but taking the burden on, like somebody's caught up in something themselves, and we're all human and this happens, but they get caught up in the same thing oneself. But the compassion is actually much lighter, that sense of a kind of a lightness of being, where there's a kind of an awareness of it and the emotion and everything else that might be happening, but not caught up in it. But that's when the heart really opens in a different way. And those responses that come from that kind of heavy, burdensome empathy are often about how can I fix the other person so I can feel all right again, not necessarily what the other person really needs. Whereas that compassion that comes from that sense of lightness is a kind of an ability to respond when a response is needed, an ability to just be with somebody if somebody just needs them to be with them. And so that lightness, I think, provides for a much more nuanced and perhaps much more helpful response than comes from that sort of other sort of empathy, which is much heavier.
Definitely. I guess it's a good sign if we're feeling lighter. I mean, something must be happening, right? I think it's a very good prognostic sign, as they might say in the medical world.
Yeah. And I think some people might misconstrue lightness with not caring, lightness with not noticing, as if, well, I feel light because I'm just not troubled by somebody else. But it's a kind of an ability, even in the midst of maybe great sadness, to still feel that kind of lightness. And I think that's got a lot to do with that capacity the non-attachment, I think, comes in here. The thoughts, the feelings, the emotions, the sensations are there, but it's kind of being experienced as a sort of a flowing stream rather than being completely consumed by it. And
yes. Yeah. So it's a joy to read some of the comments around this, learners starting to realize these automatic behavioral patterns that they're in and to step out of them and to perhaps be a little bit more compassionate and open. Something else that some of our learners have noticed, though, is that they might have a moment of being a little more open and vulnerable, perhaps sharing what's really going on for themselves. And then right at the end of that, it's fascinating reading the comments, right at the end of that, a little bit of shame shows up. Right? Which suddenly it's like, and then there's an apologizing. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm fine. Like almost like we need to sort of tie it up in a nice little bow rather than just being vulnerable. Yeah. And I see this a lot as a psychologist as well, that when we start to become vulnerable, the emotion of shame which is a sort of a sense that we need to hide something or present ourselves well in the world, it commonly shows up and sort of just tries to sort of get us away from that vulnerability. But the ability to perhaps not do that, that might be a good practice, I think, for some of our learners, to be vulnerable, what's really going on, really sort of starting to communicate in those different ways, and then just to sit with that discomfort and allow the other person to sit with the discomfort, because in that staying present with discomfort, there's also a connection that's there that's perhaps lost when we then apologize for having been honest for a moment. So I really like that comment.
Yeah, and I think there's perhaps a really important distinction here between, because really sharing and revealing things, on a deeper level is not always easy, and it's not always appropriate in certain circumstances or with perhaps some people. And so whether that sort of stepping back is because, no, this is not the appropriate place or time or person is one thing, as opposed to this other thing, which is an habitual shutting down. It's sort of like even with the person who might be there with us or for us, or a time where we really do need to talk, but we close it down because we're uncomfortable with being vulnerable. And I think we need to kind of make a distinction, because we don't necessarily want to, go around and be revealing everything to everybody all the time, because some people may not really listen in the same kind of compassionate way, or some situations might be less appropriate. But often that sort of closing down comes from ourselves, and it really does block our ability to notice and resolve issues and to have somebody there for us.
Yeah, Craig, it's a very good point. And I really like what Brene Brown says about this when she talks about vulnerability. She does a very good job of, distinguishing it from oversharing or from other things like that. It's the willingness perhaps to, show a little bit more of ourselves, but with that awareness that you're talking about. Now, Craig, a lot of our learners as well, of course, have started to notice that some of these habits that they're noticing are long-standing, well-ingrained habits with lots of neurons recruited into those neural pathways. So it can be a bit of a challenge, can't it, to step out of them and to start changing those habits.
Yeah, and even if we're just noticing the presence and the force of the habit, then that's a sign of progress in itself, because we're aware of the thing that we're not necessarily previously aware of, perhaps before we started practicing mindfulness. But the awareness opens up the opportunity to choose to do something different. And even into our old age, there's always capacity to make these changes, but we have to have the mind open to doing that. We have to put in the effort to practice, being different. And sometimes these long established patterns of behavior are very much entrenched in families and friendships and so on. And some of those challenges, long-standing grievances that we might have, a number of our learners are noticing that bringing that sort of mindful compassion to those long-standing relationships was not easy initially.
No.
Especially for the repeat learners, finding just staying with those practices, it gets easier over time. And finding things are possible now that weren't possible perhaps a few months ago.
Yeah. And of course, one of the most powerful things that we can do if we want to cultivate these new habits is to do meditations like the loving kindness and self-compassion meditations. Because in the end, all of these habits kind of begin in our mind. And so if on a consistent daily basis we're making loving kindness wishes and having compassionate thoughts, even for people who we have difficult relationships with, a lot of our learners have pointed out, and this comes up every time in this course, that in the beginning it feels a bit weird. Like, why would I wish you happiness? It just feels unnatural or forced or strange. But interestingly, the people that persist with it over time find that it starts to become a little less forced and a little more natural. And over time, of course, we start to actually cultivate feelings of goodwill for somebody, even if we have a challenging relationship. We might have very clear boundaries. We might choose to be nowhere near them, but at least we can let go of some of that resentment and all that contraction in ourselves. And sometimes it also just opens up possibilities for a different kind of relationship. So those meditations can be a really powerful thing to do to reprogram those habits.
Yes, and if we think it's about, well, what can I practice to make somebody else different? So if I practice mindfulness, will all of a sudden somebody else become a saint or something else? Well, I don't know. I don't think it necessarily. what we can do is work on ourselves, because we've got to bring awareness to and make a decision about, do we want to live with the effect of long-term resentment and everything else? Because regardless of what happens for somebody else, we can find ourselves burning up over that. One of our learners saying, I'd love to be more compassionate with somebody, obviously they had some significant grievances with. What's the smallest and first step? Well, I think this person, the very fact that they want to actually be able to cultivate compassion with somebody they have a grievance with is already taking a number of steps. That person's well down the path just by the fact that they actually want to bring compassion to that relationship. I think probably the first step is every time we notice that we're feeding a very negative internal story, narrative about that person, etc. Then if we bring mindfulness to that, then we can stop feeding that narrative. We can step out of that narrative and just come back to where we are. Because if we don't, then that's pretty much the story that we live in for our lives, and it doesn't help.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, all of this in the end is about having better relationships with ourselves, but also with others. And I really like some of the comments this week that COVID's offered us this fantastic opportunity to sort of pause and reflect on what's important, what our priorities are, how we want to live our lives, and of course, how we want to relate to others. So there are some really great comments about relating more generally, weren't there?
Yes, that's right. And look, you know, and if we're mindful, there was, you know, stories about being on a plane and somebody was very difficult and angry next to them, but being able to be more at ease with oneself. But of course, if we're sitting next to somebody who's angry and we react, well, you know, we can escalate that sort of tension and that anger and frustration. And if you're on a 15-hour long haul flight, that's a very long flight, rather than not necessarily feeding and accentuating that anger or frustration that somebody else might be experiencing. I think mindfulness gives us the opportunity to make discerning choices around that.
Yeah, and of course, there are lots of examples given about work relationships, and sometimes we are stuck. It's just, let's face it, sometimes we're stuck working with people who are really challenging.
Yeah.
I guess there it's about applying all the things we've talked about today, isn't it? Letting go of that resentment that we carry that hurts us, so we can just set that aside. And at the same time, we can have very clear boundaries about what's okay and what's not. We can be very assertive about our needs and our boundaries. And so all of those things go together. You know, mindfulness isn't about allowing bad behavior. It's not about just accepting this person next to us who might be acting in really sort of damaging or inappropriate ways. You know, sometimes compassion is to say, no, that's not okay, and that's not helping you, and it's not helping me. And that sort of that more wrathful aspect of compassion they talk about in certain wisdom traditions. It's not always just gentle and loving and accepting and kind. Sometimes it's like, don't stick the knife in the toaster, slap the hand away, you know, that kind of thing. So sometimes it is about just being very assertive, having good boundaries, but also just not carrying all that stuff that hurts us so much.
Yeah, and I think in those kind of more mindful responses, if we could put it that way, is that the response is not coming from a place of wanting to hurt the other person. It's coming from just setting some...
Coming from love, from compassion, right? Yeah, definitely.
And if we're lucky enough, we might also at the same time recognize somebody's being very difficult. They're being a human being, having a human moment. We may or may not notice perhaps the stresses and pressures and things that have gone on in their work life, and we happen to be the person in front of them that they're taking it out on. Or we might not notice the ways that we're pressing their buttons, and that person's got a history and an upbringing and everything else. So if we're a little more mindful, we just create a little bit of latitude and maybe take on a little less of their burden. Speak if we need to, give patience and some space if we need to. At least we can be very conscious of the fact that, you know, when that reactive response comes up in the workplace or home or anywhere else, we often inflame a situation, and all of a sudden there's a real back and forth, two people wanting to hurt each other and make each other's life very difficult. And obviously the person who's got a particular level of power and everything else, you know, can wield that power in some very, some unwise ways. So these are difficult, but I think that stimulus and response again comes in here, that there is the opportunity to make a more discerning response, and there's something that needs to be said, but it comes from a different place if we're more mindful, rather than that sort of automatic pilot emotive, reactive kind of cycle that can very easily, get a lot of momentum behind it.
Yeah, beautiful. That's just so true. So to all our learners, please keep this wonderful conversation going. Please keep supporting each other and sharing your thoughts and questions. Please follow the mentors if you haven't already. And Craig and I will see you all next week, where we're going to talk about self-compassion and how that can paradoxically actually boost our performance at whatever we're doing, as well as, of course, increase our well-being and mental health. We're going to look at some other ways of rewiring the brain in positive directions, and also how we can apply mindfulness to things like managing chronic pain. So, we look forward to seeing you all then.